Sorry, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let's start with the end and work our way to the beginning, which is Masada, right? In the spring of 73 CE, which is 3 years after the temple had been destroyed, after Jerusalem has been razed to the ground, after the Beit HaMikdash was burnt, the Jews had submitted to Roman rule. The Roman coin that had the words Judea captive, that Judea has been captured, was already minted and in circulation. And yet the war continues. Where does it continue? In Masada. You have this little enclave of not a lot of people. How many Jews were living on Masada? 960 people. But these 960 people weren't going anywhere. And the Romans were trying unsuccessfully for a while to destroy the last remnants of this Jewish fight against them, this revolution. And in the spring of 73 CE, they finally got this large army to come and destroy the Jews that were in Masada. They built a ramp, which you see when you go to Masada, you see the Roman ramp going up the second side, and they built their own ramp going up to the mountaintop. The Jews they came with their battering rams. The Jews built two walls. They built a wooden wall, they put dirt, and a second wall. So they were able to absorb the blows of the battering ram. And when the Romans realized they couldn't break through that way, they countered with fire. They released a torrent of blazing arrows, and the wall caught on fire. And then, as Josephus describes it, a very powerful north wind was blowing that seemed to be taking the fire away from the walls of Masada towards the Roman camp, towards their tents. And then suddenly the wind just changed, and the wind began to blow very strongly towards the south. And as the defenders in Masada were watching and hoping that the Roman tents would be burnt instead of their wall, they watched the wall be compromised. It was already very late in the day, it was already getting dark. And they knew that in the morning the Romans were going to come up the mountain and finally invade and conquer Masada. And so their leader, a man by the name of Elazar ben Yair, he gathers together the people on the top of Masada and he gives them his final speech. Text number 1, Lori.
What is the page now?
Page 50. Page 50. Text number 1. This is from the Josephus describing the text, the final speech of Elazar ben Yair.
It is clear that we will be captured at the break of day, but it is still possible for us to die in a glorious manner, together with our dearest friends. Our enemies cannot by any means hinder this, although they very much desire to take us alive. Let our wives die before they are abused, and our children die before they taste slavery. And after we have slain them, oh gosh, really? You're making me read this? Let us mutually confer this benefit upon each other, preserving our liberty as a noble shroud. But first, let us destroy our belongings and the fortress by fire. I am sure it will cause great grief to the Romans that they will not be able to capture us alive, and that they will be deprived of our belongings. Let us spare nothing but our provisions. They will be a testimonial when we are dead that we were not subdued for want of necessities, but that in keeping with our initial resolve, we had preferred death over slavery. Why did they run?
Where should they run to? There was nowhere to run.
They couldn't go in the other direction.
They're on the mountaintop.
Have you been to Masada? No. Okay, here's a picture of Masada, just to give you some perspective. You kind of, when you're up there, and the Romans are all around you. Running was not an option. Fighting was an option. Why they didn't fight is a question we'll discuss. Yes?
Was Josephus there?
Okay, how did Josephus know what Elazar ben Yair says to his followers before they all commit suicide? That's an excellent question. And the answer is that there was 2 ladies and 5 kids that survived. When they were killing everyone, either they hid or they didn't get killed, and they were wounded, but they didn't actually die. And so when the Romans came up on the mountain the next day, they found 2 living women and 5 children that had survived the destruction, the self-suicide of the other 953 people on the top of Masada. So that's, he didn't hear word for word, but first of all, Josephus knew, you know what, since you're asking about Josephus, let's talk about Josephus for a second. Actually, what a note here. We're going to be quoting Josephus a lot tonight. In fact, all the history, actually all, but most of the history we have of the destruction of the Second Temple, that whole era, and of the Battle of Masada we know from the writings of Josephus. Although later, when Yigal Yadin would excavate Masada, the archaeological findings would very much back up what Josephus had said. What they found archaeologically very much fits to his writings. Who is Josephus? Anyone here? By raise of hands, who here has heard of Josephus? Okay, who was he really? He was born a nice Jewish boy, Yosef ben Matisyahu HaKohen, born in Jerusalem. He was a religious Jew. He claimed that he was opposed to the revolt against the Romans. But nonetheless, he was appointed as a commander in the Galilee when the Romans came in 66 CE, and they began from the north of Israel, destroying all the towns and villages in the north. He was a commander, and he ended up holding a fortress of Josaphat for 47 days. He held out against the Romans in the fortress, and when they realized that they were going to be destroyed, so the fortress was captured. Him and 40 men ran away. They managed to hide in a cave, and when they realized they were going to be caught, so the men wanted to commit suicide. The same thing that happened in Masada. Exact same thing. And they did lots to see who would kill who would be the last. He contrived the lots that he would be the last one to be killed. And when it was down to the last guy, him and one other person, so he convinced the other person that why should we kill ourselves, let's better surrender to the Romans. And he, as the commander of an army in the Galilee, surrendered to the Romans. He was taken to Vespasian. He was obviously a prisoner at first, but after Vespasian became the emperor, and he claimed that he had told Vespasian to be emperor, but when you get back to that later, he was used by the Romans to try and convince the Jews to submit. And he became an ally of the Romans. He joined the Roman army. He was tried to convince the Jews to surrender in Jerusalem, and he adopted the Roman name Flavius after Vespasian's family. And after the fall of Jerusalem, he moved to Rome, and he spent the rest of his life writing books about Judaism and about the history. Several books that he wrote. He claimed he was always a religious Jew till the end. His entire life he remained, in his mind, a believer of God and of the Torah. He has books that defend the Jewish approach versus the Hellenistic approach. And he is more or less considered a reliable source of the history. In the Talmud and in many Jewish sources, there's a lot of references given to a book called Yosifun, which was written in Italy. If it's based on the book Josephus, a lot of discussion about that. Anyway, that's who Josephus is. She wasn't there on the mountaintop, but there was 2 women and 5 kids that were alive, and that's where he gets the gist of the speech from.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Why would anybody want to live on top of that?
First of all, this was a king's winter vacation home, right? Have you ever been to Masada?
It was
I haven't been
palatial.
to Israel. How
Okay,
did we
are you
get-
coming with us?
It was
I got an email today, side note, I got an email today from Shmuley Karp that they're almost full with registration. And if we have any more people coming, that they're going to hold spots for us if you want. So, March, I'll take you to Masada. So if you go to Masada,
It's a fortified position.
Masada was, okay, very, very briefly. Masada was built by King Herod originally as a vacation home, a winter home, because it gets very hot, very cold in Jerusalem, etc. And in the desert, this is in the south, this is near the Dead Sea. In the desert area, it's warmer, you get the air. So that was his palace that he built, a fortified palace.
And did he build an elevator or an escalator to get to it?
There's a ramp.
I ran in a million
They had, they had horses, they had camels take them up the ramp, whatever it is, the donkeys.
Slaves.
Yeah, you know how hard it was to build that thing? The views are magnificent, by the way. And you go up there, I mean, the views.
Yeah, the
of
views are
Masada.
incredible, but who would want to live up there? It's like desolate.
Then the Romans made it into an army base. It's a great place for an army base because you have an excellent view of everything going on around you. It's extremely difficult to attack it. And in fact, it took the Romans 3 years to destroy this one little place because you're going up, the Jews are on top of you, they're shooting down. So they had to build their own ramp. Under fire, they had to build their own ramp, being attacked by arrows by the Jews. It was a fortified place.
Why didn't the Jews send like flaming oil or something down the road?
They did all that. They threw down flaming oil. They did all that stuff. They held it out for 3 years. 960 Jews.
The Roman army.
Yeah. What did they do with those women? In Yiddish is an expression. Frek nicht die Kasche auf der Meise. You don't ask questions on the story. What did they do with the woman? Can I tell you a joke? I don't be a, yeah.
Sure.
That's it. Please spell it out.
Are we going to discuss them committing suicide?
Yes, very much.
Okay.
That's going to be that's one of the questions we're going to address today. Why do they not fight? Why do they commit suicide?
It's
Yeah,
not even that. I mean, it's against Jewish law.
it's against Jewish law. Absolutely. Not only there's two issues. There's two issues here. One is that they committed suicide. There's another issue. They committed murder.
Yeah.
They killed their wives. They killed their children. They killed each other. It was. Are you allowed to murder someone else? From the Romans, we'll discuss. You know.
Anything though.
Yeah.
Didn't they inhabit Masada as a sanctuary because the Romans were taking over everything and they thought they were safe up there?
They were safe up there.
Well, I think that's why, she said why they lived there. I think that's why they went there.
Oh, became an army base. This was their fortress.
This is where
Don't forget
This
the
is a
Romans
fortress.
had conquered Jerusalem and took over.
They conquered the whole of Israel.
So these people thought they were safe up there.
You're a sitting duck though up there because you've got no place to run.
They must have let a
Yeah, but there was nowhere for anyone to get up to them until the Romans.
What?
After a 3-year siege, there'd be a...
They have plenty of provisions. In fact, they said, let's leave our provisions so that they know that we didn't give up because we had no food. They had food. They were well provided. They were stocked up. In fact, another side interesting note, and I've given a speech about this on Yom Kippur one year, they found in their archaeological search, in their digging, they found the pit, the seed of a date from their storehouse. They found the storehouses. They excavated the entire Masada. They found the kosher mikveh there, which is a fascinating appendix about the whole mikveh and about when the rabbis came to look at the mikveh. They found the synagogue. They found the storage rooms where they had all the food supplied. And in the storage room, they found the date, a seed, still preserved, because it's very dry there. It's a very good way to preserve.
So they didn't use anything as a preservative, just the dryness itself?
It was a naturally safe place to have dried food. You're in a very dry area, not so much humidity, not like Florida. And they took this date palm from the times of the Masada. They successfully grew it. They planted, they grew it, and now they're growing second generation date palms from that date palm that they successfully grew.
And how far is Masada from Jerusalem?
Not far.
A few hours, about a 3-hour drive, 2-hour drive. How far is Masada? A few hours by car.
I mean,
2 hours?
We'll be in a bus.
From Jerusalem to Masada.
2 hours.
About
2 hours. 2 hours. The whole Israel is not that big. You know, from beginning to end is how long is 6 hours, 7 hours from top to bottom? It's not right.
Yeah,
Israel's not that big.
right. And going across, it's only...
That's another. We discussed that. Okay.
2 hours.
Okay. So what we need to understand tonight, what we want to address is who are these people that are holed up in Masada? Who are they? And why were they going to take this very, very drastic step, which is completely against traditional Jewish law, not only law, against the whole fundamental belief system of Judaism, to kill their families and to kill themselves. And obviously they were separated from the rest of the Jewish people. There were other Jews living in Israel that weren't living up there, that had submitted to the Romans. Why were they fighting? So we're going to get to that. But in order to get there, we first need to understand the context, right? What was the fight with the Romans all about? So let us show you a beautiful lesson video.
The Jewish revolt against Rome changed Jewish history in an unbelievable way.
While the Second Temple stood in Jerusalem, the Jews lived under mostly foreign rule. At first, when the Jews returned to Judea from the Babylonian captivity to build the Second Temple, they peacefully submitted to Persian rule. Then, with the sudden rise of Alexander the Great, the entire region came under Greek subjugation, including the Jewish homeland in 332 BCE. As before, the Jews bore their foreign yoke in silence. But the calm was shattered when Antiochus IV Epiphanes, a Syrian Greek tyrant, declared war on the Jewish religion.
There's no evidence for any attempt of Jews to revolt against the foreign rulers until you get to the point of the Maccabean revolt, when persecution of Jews begins.
The Maccabean revolt brought full independence to the Jewish people for the first time since the start of the Second Temple era. 8 Maccabean monarchs sustained this independence until the passing of Queen Shlomtzion, or Salome Alexandra, in 67 BCE. Then, civil war erupted between the supporters of the queen's 2 sons, Hyrcanos and Aristobulus, both of whom claimed the throne. In 63 BCE, the sparring heirs to the Maccabean crown made the disastrous mistake of approaching the legendary Roman general Pompey for arbitration, thereby inviting foreign interference into the governance of the Jewish homeland.
By that time, the Romans really wanted to control Eretz Yisrael. First of all, for economic reasons, they were trying to create a breadbasket for ancient Rome because they had insufficient food. Second of all, and this is really important here, they needed a kind of fortress, a boundary line against the Parthians, who by that time had moved from what we today call Iran into areas of Babylonia, Iraq of today.
Pompey chose Hyrcanos as the 9th Maccabean king. But when his brother Aristobulus rejected Pompey's decision, the Roman general invaded the land of Israel and seized control of the kingdom, slaughtering thousands of Jews in the process.
The upshot of what happened was that this is how the country came under Roman rule.
Thus began decades of crippling taxation and oppression that impoverished the nation.
Most Jews were willing to settle for Roman rule as long as the Romans left them alone beyond taxation. But some of these people were not. And so you could even say that the sparks of the eventual Jewish revolt against Rome began to burn from the second the Romans arrived.
In 54 BCE, the Roman proconsul Crassus looted all of the gold in the Holy Temple's treasury to fund his expedition against the Parthians. In 46 BCE, Herod, then governor of the Galilee, massacred hundreds of Jews to enforce excessive taxation on behalf of Rome. 2 years later, the Roman proconsul Cassius sold the Jews of 4 towns as slaves as a penalty for failing to pay the steep taxes Cassius had imposed on the residents of Judea to fund his war against Mark Antony. The national tragedy thickened in 42 BCE when the Roman ruler Mark Antony installed Herod as client king. Herod impoverished the populace through massive taxation to fund the construction of lavish palaces, fortresses, Greek temples, and new cities. Just before his death in 4 BCE, he installed an image of an eagle, the symbol of Roman rule, on the Holy Temple, and then massacred the Jewish sages and their students who dared to remove it. Shortly after his death, Herod's son Archelaus succeeded him and promptly massacred over 3,000 Jews. In desperation, the Jews turned to Rome, pleading that their homeland be annexed to the Roman province of Syria, so that instead of tyrannical puppet kings, Syrian proconsuls could govern them as fairly as they governed Syria itself. Rome acceded to this request in 6 CE, and the terror of the client kings came to an end.
The net result of this is that the Romans put in a system of procurators. These procurators were kind of local governors under the larger province of Syria. Now, some of these people were great people, like Marcus Tullius Cicero, the great orator and lawyer from Rome, but some of them were horrible.
A number of procurators sought to amass personal wealth via excessive taxation and other corrupt means. This angered the population of Judea.
The obligation of a Roman governor was to deliver a predetermined amount of tax money to Rome. Furthermore, these Roman governors were allowed to keep as much of the money that they could collect beyond that amount.
The procurators were also frequently indifferent to Jewish religious sensibilities. In 30 CE, Procurator Pontius Pilate ordered his soldiers to carry their standards with images of the Roman emperor through Jerusalem.
Now, the problem of the Roman standards was that they were worshipped by the Romans, so they were idolatrous images.
This was a dire offense to Jewish sensibilities, especially in their sacred capital. Between 37 and 41 CE, the Emperor Caligula demanded that a statue of himself be erected in the Holy Temple. The Jews were prepared to go to any lengths to stop this offense, And knowing this, Publius Petronius, the Syrian proconsul, did his best to persuade Caligula to rescind his decree. But Caligula was adamant.
Gaius Caligula sent him a letter that said that if he didn't do it, he should commit suicide because of the fact that he would be executed for it. Luckily for Petronius, who decided to refuse these terrible orders, he got a message that Caligula was dead before the day in which he was going to have to stand up to him, the deadline date. So the situation passed. But the Jews were ready to lay down their lives for this, to stop these idols from being brought into the city.
The weight of oppression and impoverishment led to the formation of Jewish brigands who targeted Roman villages and wealthy Jews. These winds of lawlessness intensified around the year 48 CE and endured for the next 2 decades. The pot finally came to a boil in 66 CE under the thumb of the Roman procurator to Judea, Gessius Florus. Decades earlier, around 20 BCE, King Herod had built the Mediterranean port city of Caesarea, but its Jewish and Gentile populations each claimed that Caesarea was made for them, and they fought for control of the city. In 66 CE, Nero ruled in favor of the city's Gentiles, who then launched acts of provocation against their Jewish neighbors. Gessius Florus, the Roman procurator, accepted the Jews' gifts of silver in return for a promise to terminate the acts of provocation, but he failed to act. News of the Jewish loss of Caesarea and Florus's corruption sparked widespread indignation. But the gifts that Florus received from the Jews of Caesarea didn't satisfy his appetite, and so Florus made what would prove to be a fateful move for both Judea and Rome. He demanded 17 talents of silver from the Holy Temple's treasury. Some Jews began to mock Florus in the open. They carried a basket about and begged for some copper coins for Florus, as if he were a destitute beggar. This was a terrible blow to the procurator's pride. Florus marched with cavalry and infantry against Jerusalem and commanded its leaders to deliver those who mocked him into his hands. But the Jewish leaders responded that the people were peaceably disposed and begged forgiveness for the offenders. Florus was incensed. He ordered his troops to plunder the upper market of Jerusalem and to slay anyone they met. The soldiers forced themselves into many homes and slew their inhabitants. About 3,600 Jerusalemites were murdered that day. To complete his provocation, Florus sent troops to raid the temple treasury. But the Jews had seen enough. The people blocked the narrow roads leading to the temple, making it impossible for the soldiers to pass. Some stood on the roofs of their homes and threw makeshift weapons at the Romans who were held up on the roads. The Romans had no choice but to retreat. Across the land of Israel, the air was thick with mutiny. But what was the Jewish aspiration of the time? Did the Jews hope to repel a tyrannical Roman governor? Or did they feel the time was ripe to cast off the shackles of Rome once and for all? As subsequent events loudly proclaimed, the Jews of that era could not come to a consensus on this dilemma.
A lot of people just assume that the revolt was unanimous. In fact, for a long time before and even during the revolt, Jews were debating whether it was right or wrong to revolt against Rome. There was a constant controversy among Jews, dividing families, friends, towns, and it was never resolved, really.
So now you just saw how the Jews were fighting against this Roman procurator Florus. That was pretty unanimous because this guy was out of control. He was looting the temple. He was completely disregarded any value for the Jewish beliefs, etc. But the question is as follows. Were the Jews that were involved in the revolt, were they only in the revolt against the local Roman procurator Florus? Or were they fighting a bigger battle against Rome, and this man Florus just happened to be the one that represented Rome at the time? Meaning, as you heard at the end of the video, there was a big debate within the Jewish community. Are we actually fighting Rome, or just trying to get this particular Roman procurator removed and get someone else sent here instead? Okay? Let's see text number 2. Carolyn, read.
At this time, some of those who encouraged the people to go to war made an assault upon a certain fortress called Masada. They took it by treachery, slew the Romans that were there, and put their own garrison there. At the same time, another incident occurred at the temple. Eleazar, son of Ananias, the high priest, a very bold youth, who was the temple captain, persuaded those that officiated in the temple to receive no gift or sacrifice from a foreigner. This was the true beginning of our war with the Romans, for they rejected the sacrifice on behalf of Caesar and Rome on this account. When many of the chief priests and notables besought them not to omit the sacrifice, which it was customary for them to offer for the ruler, they would not be prevailed upon.
Okay, so basically two things happened at this time, right after where the video ends. Number one is that the rebels captured Masada, which was in a Roman fort, and they turned it into a Jewish stronghold. That's issue number one. Issue number two, or incident number two, is that the sacrifice that was brought in the Caesar's honor, and there's different versions. There was a daily offering, there was a special one-time offering, but whatever it is, it was an offering that was brought specifically in honor of the Roman emperor that was decided not to be brought into the temple. Now, not all the Jews were in agreement with this. As we read, there were some Jews that were saying that we got to bring the sacrifice. Let's not fight against the Romans. We're fighting a losing battle. Others didn't agree. Okay? So let's try and understand the two sides of this debate, as we normally like to do. Let's try and understand exactly what was at stake, and then we will eventually get back to Masada and why they wanted to commit suicide. Okay? Let's start text number 3. We'll start with some of the arguments in favor of the revolt. Text number 3, Renee.
Although the principles of the provincial arrangement were tolerable to most Jews, what took place in practice was often less than satisfactory. It is not hard to imagine how the Roman officers in Palestine did not always comprehend or appreciate the religious practices of the Jews. It must have seemed strange to them that the Jews reacted so subtly and belligerently to matters which seemed to them so common and so unconsequential, such as the placing of image-bearing banners in Jerusalem. The difficult of understanding Jewish peculiarities sometimes led to procurators to side with the Hellenistic part of the population in Palestine. At other times, as we shall see, matters of religious concern to Jews were treated with indifference or disdain. Related disruption were frequently handled by military suppression, such as absence of diplomacy on the part of the procurators simply served to escalate Jewish indignation.
Right. Okay, so argument number 1 in favor of revolting against Rome was very simply that there is a limit to how much abuse you can suffer. The procurators were completely unsensitive to the needs of the Jewish people. There was terrible religious abuse, taxation abuse. Enough is enough, we gotta fight back. Right? You can ask, what about the odds that are against you? You're fighting the superpower of the time. You're fighting the most powerful army that existed at that time. So, logically you can say maybe you're right, but sometimes when you get hit, you hit back. Inaction is not an option. If they're going to attack, I'm going to fight back harder. Right? There's a quote from Shakespeare from The Merchant of Venice about Shylock. It's a good text. Text number 4, Faith, you want to read?
Sure. If it will feed nothing else, it will feed my revenge. He hath disgraced me and hindered me 500,000, laughed at my losses, mocked at my pains, scorned my nation, broken my bargains, fooled my friends, heated my enemies. And what's this reason? I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew's eyes, hath not Jew's hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, suffered to the same diseases, cooled by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge?
Right, okay. That's point number 2, is basically that inaction is not an option. They reach a certain threshold, a certain whatever, the red line.
Cross the line.
You cross the line and that's it, then we have no choice. We have to fight back. I'm going to skip the next text. I just want to move a little faster through this. Number 3 is that many of the Jews thought that the Parthians would help. There were other Jews that were not living in Judea, in Jerusalem, that also didn't like the Romans. And so they actually sent a delegation to the Parthian Empire to the east saying, join our revolt. So they're hoping that once they start, it would create a larger movement, not only with the Parthians, but with other nations. There were many people under the Romans. Again, you start creating a culture of revolt against Rome, and if Rome gets involved in many different wars in different places, they're going to leave the Jews alone. And finally, if you are living in the time of this era, 70 CE, who's your role model? Who's your hero?
The emperor.
The Maccabees. Hanukkah's coming up in a few weeks. Who are the Maccabees? Small group of Jews that fought against a very mighty nation. And they won, right? Text number 6. Louis, you want to read text number 6?
In the days of Matthias, the son of Yohanan the high priest, the Hasmonean and his sons, when the wicked Hellenic government rose up against your people Israel to make you forget the Torah and violate the decrees of your will. But you, in your abounding mercies, stood by them in the time of their distress. You waged their battles, defended their rights, and avenged the wrong done to them. You delivered the mighty into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, the impure into the hands of the pure, the wicked into the hands of the righteous, and the wanton sinners into the hands of those who occupy themselves with your Torah.
Right, so the Jews that were living then viewed themselves as the next generation of Maccabees. So yes, the odds were against them. Yes, they were fighting the Roman Empire, but God's on our side. Deliver the few into the men into the hands of the few, the mighty in the hands of the weak. We will prevail. Okay? Makes sense to you? You can see such an argument? Yes? Now there's another side to the coin, of course. Why were there many rabbis against this revolt with Rome? So the most clear argument we have is from King Agrippa II. They actually sent men to try and quash the rebellion. He was a grandson of Herod, so he obviously was in favor of the Romans to a certain extent. But his argument, he was on the east side of the Jordan River, and he came to Jerusalem to try and convince Jerusalem not to fight against the Romans. What was his argument? Alex, you want to read? Text number, no? Josh? Text number 7.
The same procreator will not remain forever, and it is probable that a successor will come with more moderate inclinations. But after war, if it is stated, it is not easily terminated or executed without calamity. What sort of troops and armor do you rely on? Where is your fleet that will sweep the Roman seas? Where is your treasury needed for your undertaking? Hasn't our army been beaten often, even by neighboring nations, while the power of the Romans is invincible in all parts of habitable earth? Are you richer than the Gauls, stronger than the Germans, wiser than the Greeks, more numerous than all the peoples of the world? Why are you confident that you can oppose the Romans? Perhaps you will answer that it is hard to endure servitude. This is true, but how much harder is it to the Greeks, who were esteemed as the noblest of all people under the sun? Nevertheless, although they inhabited large territory, they are subservient to Rome. When almost all people under the sun submit to the Roman arms, will you be the only people that wages war against them? Have pity, therefore, if not on your children and wives, and upon this city and its great crescents. Spare the temple and preserve for yourselves the holy house and all its holy treasures. Because once the Romans conquer you, they will no longer abstain from these, saying that their former forbearance have been met so ungratefully. Okay, so what's the argument that he's making? Number 1 is very simple. The odds are way against you. You can't win. Exactly right.
You're fighting the superpower of the time. Much more powerful nations than you have tried to fight the Romans, and they have failed. So why do you think you're going to fight? I would argue there's really a second argument that he's being included in his statement here. It's not in the PowerPoint, but there's a second argument he's making, which is that the risks are too great. This is not just if you lose a battle, you lose a battle. If you lose this battle, what happens?
They take over.
Jerusalem is destroyed. The temple is destroyed. The future of Judaism. The risks, you're taking a very, very serious risk right now. And by the way, that's true. We see what happened. Right? What's the next argument? Oops, he says freedom of worship. If you look at text number 8, the Romans did not, let's do this quickly. Tom, going to read out?
Yeah.
Text number 8.
The Romans generally guaranteed the local customs of the people in the empire. As a result of the enlightened policies of Augustus, the Jews had been granted special considerations by the Romans regarding their religious freedom. Those privileges, which were the most extensive given to any subject people in the empire, continued under the provincial relationship. The Romans did not require emperor worship from the Jews. They accepted Jewish allegiance in the form of 2 daily sacrifices in the temple on behalf of the emperor's welfare. They permitted the Jews to accumulate sacred monies for the temple treasury without interference. The Romans did not conscript Jewish men into the Roman army, since such service would have conflicted with the observance of the Sabbath and other Jewish festivals. Also, they did not require that Jews appear in court on the Sabbath. In addition, Rome was committed to respect such local customs as a prohibition against images in Jerusalem. In principle, the Jewish religion has the protection of the Roman Empire.
Okay, very good, thank you. So what's the argument here? The Jews are not like the Maccabees. Why not?
Because the Hellenistic period, the Romans allowed
The Greeks.
Jews- well, the Greeks, to consider the Torah just as a book. It wasn't the Torah.
What were the Maccabees fighting for? Religious freedom. They were fighting for religious freedom. They were fighting to be allowed to worship God the way they wanted. The Romans were not trying, what?
The Romans were allowing them to.
The Romans were allowing them to. And therefore many people are saying, the rabbis are saying, why are we fighting against the Romans? We're fighting, they're allowing us to worship. Yes, there were incidents. Yes, this one particular procreator, he brought in the standards with the Roman images of their gods. But as a general principle, the Romans had no issue with the Jews maintaining their own culture and their own religion and their own temple. They had no problem with the temple standing. They had no problem with the Jews bringing sacrifices. In fact, they sent sacrifice on behalf of the emperor. Go ahead, pray to your God, do your own thing. We won't make your men go into the army, so you don't have the problem with the Shabbos and the kosher food. So they were not like the Maccabees. They weren't fighting that battle for religious freedom. Yeah?
David Rhodes is saying really two opposite things, it seems.
What?
In the same text is being cited. Israel and Revolution, Philadelphia.
Yeah, what's the two things?
I mean, well, in the first case, he's talking about how harshly the Romans are treating and not respecting their traditions and their practice.
You're saying earlier.
And then here, he's saying the opposite.
That particular incident was
It's
Flores.
the same part of the same text, the same pages.
Sometimes the procreators didn't understand exactly the nuances of Jewish ritual and Jewish law. There were issues. I'm not saying that the Jews had a great life under the Romans, but on principle, the key word is in principle. Fundamentally, they were not opposed to Jews worshiping God the way Jews wanted to worship God.
Okay, but
There were clashes, yes. There were incidents that happened.
But what Rhodes is saying in text 8 also differs from what Josephus says in text 2, where he says that they rejected the sacrifice of the Romans.
That's the Jews rejected it. The Jews, text 2 is saying the Jews stopped bringing a sacrifice on behalf of the emperor, which just proves the emperor had nothing against the Jews bringing sacrifices. They had nothing against the Jewish form of worship. Go ahead, pray for me too.
Okay.
Okay? But, yeah. In general, the point is, in principle, the Romans were not against the Jewish people having. There was no fight against. Later there would be. Later, after the destruction of the temple, the Romans came out hard. They would outlaw the teaching of Torah. They would outlaw the circumcision. But that was later.
They rejected the sacrifices on behalf of Caesar.
There were some of the Jews that rejected the sacrifice. Some of the priests that rejected the. Incidentally, by the way, in the Dead Sea Scrolls we discussed last week, they found one of the documents called Zevach, talks about Zevach HaGoyim, the offerings of the non-Jews, and it seems that the Dead Sea sect, who disagree with the rabbis of many things, also disagree with the rabbis about allowing a non-Jew to bring a sacrifice in the temple. The rabbis allowed it, and the people in the Dead Sea did not. But whatever. The point is,
Josephus says that's the beginning of their.
That was a part of the beginning when they made it because what's really happening with the sacrifice? The Jews that are in Jerusalem are making a statement to the Romans back in Rome that this is not just a local fight between us and the local governor who's being too harsh. We're fighting against the entire Roman government, and that's when Rome comes in. That's when the big boys come in. You know, that's when it gets really messy.
Doesn't that kind of prove that the more cautious side of the argument was the correct one?
You're going in hindsight. Hindsight is 20/20, right? To properly understand the debate, we got to put ourselves in the moment. They don't know what's going to happen in the future,
Right.
so we have to put ourselves into their shoes. But I'm going to get there. Let me just finish one last point, which is that we have a precedent in Jewish law of not fighting against a governor or against the government and submitting to them from Yaakov. When Esav, the two brothers, right, Jacob and Esav wants to kill his brother, he hates his brother. And Jacob is traveling back in the land of Israel, what does he do? He sends gifts, he sends bribes, and then when Esav comes, he comes running before him, and he bows before him, and he hugs him, and he kisses him. He surrenders to him, he submits to him, and they live happily ever after. So the Jews had where to get this idea from that they should just submit to the Romans and not fight against it. Okay. Let's go back now a little bit further. Again, we're going to eventually get back to Masada. We have to understand where they start ideologically. The beginning of the Masada ideology begins in the year 6 CE with a man called Yehuda HaGalili, Judas the Galilean. This Galilean is pushing everyone, let's revolt, let's fight. This is back in 6 CE, 64 years before the destruction of the temple. Let's fight against the Romans. Well, let's get in a second why. He gets squashed, his revolution, he leads a revolution that doesn't get anywhere. Never really takes off. The Romans kill him, etc. However, what happens to his philosophy? It survives, it stays underground. Put this over here. These are the roots of the revolt. This man, Yehuda HaGalili, learns a verse. I'm going to skip a little bit to text number 11. What's the verse in text number 11? Mordechai, what is text number 11? On page
For the children of
61.
Israel are servants to me. They are my servants who I took out of the land of Egypt.
What is this verse saying if you're Judas the Galilean, Yehuda HaGalili? The verse is saying as follows. You are not allowed to worship any other master besides for God. You're not allowed to pay taxes to any other master besides for God. You cannot officially be servants or subjects of another nation. Simple. This was his ideology. He was a religious man. He kept all the laws, but in this area he disagreed with the rabbis. He said that we are not allowed to worship the Romans. We're not allowed to worship them as a god. We're not allowed to serve them. Right? What if God took us out of Egypt? What right do we have to submit to a new Pharaoh, to a new Egypt? That's how he viewed the Romans, as in Egypt. God took us out of Egypt to be servants to God. Never again are we allowed to be servants to another nation in the world. It's exclusive. God has exclusive rights to us. Okay? Now, so Judas managed to create this slight revolution in the year 6 CE, but it was repelled. However, his philosophy survives underground, and in fact, one of the leaders of the rebels in 66 CE that leads and fights very hard for a revolution against Rome is his son, Menachem, who kept his father's idea alive that we shall never become slaves or servants in another nation. Okay? Text number 12. Patty, you want to read text number 12?
Meanwhile, when Menachem, the son of Judas the Galilean, took his friends with him and went to Masada, He broke open King Herod's armory and gave arms to the people and to other brigands. With these men and his guards, he returned as king to Jerusalem to become the leader of the revolt.
So you see, the one that takes over Masada is the son of this man Yehuda, Judas the Galilean, and he is the one that is one of the major leaders in causing the revolution in the years before the destruction of the temple. The one that conquers Masada from the Romans, which is one of the two major acts that would lead the Romans to feel threatened by the revolution happening in Israel and to come and to eventually quash this revolution. Okay? Which means, if we're trying to understand the ideology of this side of the debate, for these people, for what Josephus calls them the Sicarii. The Sicarii, they had these daggers that they would keep under their cloaks, and they would murder anyone disagree with them, they would kill them. They were ruthless. The amount of killing that happened to the Jews was terrible, terrible. For them, it makes no difference if you can win against the Romans. Because success is irrelevant. They believed that we have a religious imperative never to allow ourselves to become servants of another nation. So even if you don't win, it's not about winning, it's not about independence. It's not about fighting to win.
It's not about losing either.
It's about not losing. Okay. So far, are you with me? Okay. Now, I want to go further a little bit. What happens in the historical story? Let's continue the story a little bit. What happens next? So, 66 CE, they conquer Menachem, the son of Judas, conquers Masada. They stop bringing the sacrifices in honor of the Roman emperor. Agrippas sends an army of 3,000 men to push down the revolution. What happens to these 3,000 men? Defeated. Gone. What happens next? The Roman Emperor Gallus comes. So at the very beginning, if you look in the Appendix A, there's the timeline there. You can look at it to get more of a clarity of the picture. Gallus comes. He fights a tremendous war. He sees he's not going to win. He's going to retreat. He makes a big mistake when he retreats. He retreats through the mountainous overpass of Bet Horon. You know what happens to him there? The Jews are waiting from above. They know he's going. And they attack him from above. And they literally destroy his entire army. They destroy his entire army. They take a tremendous amount of Roman weapons and materials and chariots and all this stuff that they have. Now they're well armed. They come back to Judea, they come back to Jerusalem, as the victors, and they declare independence. And in 66 CE, the Jewish people declare their own state again. An independent Jewish government for the first time in many years. They've broken free from the Romans. It's official now. They are free from the Romans. They mint their own coins. They establish their own government. They start building their own army. They start putting local governors all over the state of Israel. Now, they knew that Rome was coming back. Rome was not going to sit idly by and watch this happen. So they start preparing for war. They know that the Roman army is going to come with the real, heavy guns. But already now they're in a much better frame of mind. They're getting ready for a battle as a nation. They're ready to fight. Okay? Eventually, the Roman army arrives, led by a general called Vespasian. Vespasian comes to the head of this massive Roman army. He came from the north. He conquered one city at a time, one village at a time. With his massive army, there was no way to stand up against him. He had a scorched earth policy. Every single city he conquered, destroyed it. So the entire north of Israel was completely destroyed. The whole Galilee is destroyed. That's where Josephus was fighting against for 47 days in one little fortress. Eventually he killed everyone. He killed thousands of men and women and children, sold thousands more as slaves, conquered, destroyed, burnt everything. He finally finishes destroying the north part of Jerusalem. It took him over a year. He comes now towards Jerusalem. The northern part of Israel. He comes to Jerusalem. He comes to the leaders of Jerusalem and he says, text number 13, Steve.
When Vespasian came to subdue Jerusalem, he sent words. Fools, why do you seek to destroy the city and to burn down the temple? All I ask is that you send me one bow or one arrow in the shadow of submission, and I will leave you in place. They replied, just as we defeated the first two armies that marched against us, so shall we defeat you. As soon as Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai heard this, he summoned the people of the city and asked, my children, why are you destroying this city? Do you wish to burn the temple? What does Vespasian ask for? All he wants is one bow or one arrow and a show of submission, and he will then leave you in peace. They repeated their reply, just as we defeated the first two armies, we shall defeat him.
Okay, what's happening here? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of the greatest sages of the time, is openly advocating for surrender to the Romans. Many Jews didn't like that. But he's saying let's surrender. Why? And by the way, Josephus tells us that in general the sages were very pro-surrender to the Romans. The Nasi, the leader of the Jewish people, the formal prince of the Jewish people, was a man called Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. He also openly advocated for surrender to the Romans, and he tried, the Talmud tells us how he tried arguing with the priests to once again bring the sacrifice and honor of the Roman emperor, and they would not listen to him. So why did the sages feel that we need to surrender to the Romans? 3 reasons. Number one, as we said before,
They want the temple destroyed.
that's right. And here the Romans were allowing the freedom of worship. All the Romans were asking for was submit to us and we leave Jerusalem in peace. We don't attack the temple, we don't attack Jerusalem, we leave the city standing as is. We just want you to surrender.
He was asking them to have a sense of perspective.
Again, you're looking at hindsight. You have to put yourself into the mind, you have to put yourself into the shoes of the Jews living under that kind of persecution, living under that taxation, living under that circumstances.
That's true, but we can still, since this is maybe the most calamitous decision in Jewish
Oh, this is a
history,
calamitous decision, no doubt about it.
then you have to go back and say one side was right and the other side was wrong.
We'll do that.
History pivoted on that decision.
That's not over. Now I want to give you I want you to have a good understanding of both sides of this debate. It was by the way, this is a serious debate that would literally tear apart the Jewish community like no other debate in history. Not only because of its impact later on in history, people literally killed each other they disagreed with. And I mean literally. People were. I'm going to tell some stories soon. We still didn't get the heavy stuff. Yeah, Lori thought that the killing each other was the suicide was bad. Okay, so argument number one is that we can't rely on we can't say we're like the Maccabees because we have religious freedom, unlike the Maccabees. Number two, in Jewish law, you don't rely on miracles. You don't go into a crazy situation fighting against this massive Roman army and hope for a miracle. And number three,
Yeah, but God set a precedent with miracles. It's like you can't give us miracles and then stop taking them.
when you have no choice, you rely on miracles. But here they had a choice. The Romans weren't trying to kill the Jews. The Jews didn't need a miracle. The Jews could have surrendered. They would have had to pay taxes, but they would have been left alone.
Well, you could have said that about the Jews in Egypt. They had a choice. They could have stayed on as slaves.
No, their God said that taking you out of Egypt. That was a clear sign that was a clear thing from God. They didn't have any kind of clear image from God. Number three, their argument is that it's not disloyal to God to live under a foreign rule and pay taxes to a foreign government. Okay? So the sages said, let's surrender, let's petition the authorities, let's make sure they give us certain freedoms, that they don't have a governor that's not nice to us, etc. But let's try and make it work. Okay? In general, the mindset, the government that was controlling Judea in 66 CE was a very moderate government. So much so that the rebels, they fought against their own Jewish government. The rebels, they wanted to revolt. The Jews that were leading the government, including the prince, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, they wanted to fight a war where the battle wasn't to win. They wanted to make it long enough that the Romans they could sue for peace, and the Romans would be sick of war and give them good terms. So that was their perspective. Okay? The rebels refused to listen.
You said the Romans, they came in, they destroyed all of northern Israel, all the way to Jerusalem. Suddenly Jerusalem is okay, we're not going to destroy it, just give yourself up.
Well, okay, Jerusalem was not so easy for them to conquer. It's a very good question. They destroyed tons of cities. They killed hundreds of thousands of Jews. Why are they stopping now? So first of all, to reach a certain point, I just said it very briefly, it's a footnote, but I'll elaborate more. The Jewish preparation for war was not to win the Romans. They had no chance of winning the Romans. They made it as difficult as possible, and as many losses for the Romans, every single city they captured. Just by way of example, Josephus fought for 47 days for one little fortress. Every single city, every single army base to fight for weeks and weeks and lose Roman soldiers. It's expensive, it costs lives. The Romans want to win the war, go home, say we won, and that's it. They're willing to stop. Secondly, Jerusalem is a very well fortified city. It would take the Romans how many years to conquer Jerusalem? 3 years, no, that's correct. They came in 66 CE, 67, they come into the northern part of Israel. They don't destroy the temple till the year 70. That's 3 years. Jerusalem has heavy walls. It was not simple to get in. And the Jews were heavy fighters. When you're fighting a defensive war and you're fighting for your homeland and you're fighting people that are willing to die for their fight, the Romans knew who they were fighting against. They didn't want to fight the Jews. They fought for a year. They thought to hopefully now they'll give up. Yeah.
Just my own observation is that you're playing right into hindsight because you're assuming as a fact that if the Jews would have surrendered, that the Romans would have kept their word and be nice and everything like that. And it's just not.
That's true. It's a very valid point. Again, we don't know what would have happened if, in fact, we do know that when the Jews were under Roman rule, they had many, many problems. Many of the Roman governors were terrible to the Jews. So life was not going to be great under the Romans. No one was pretending that it would be. The rabbis were hoping and arguing that now that the Romans are desperate to make peace with us, the Romans are asking for peace. They don't want to keep on fighting for Jerusalem. The Romans don't need Jerusalem. They don't need to destroy it. They want to leave it and get taxes from it. That's what they want. They have no problem with the temple standing or with the city standing. So the Romans are asking for peace. Let's try and negotiate better terms. Let's try and make it work. That was their argument. Obviously, many people didn't like that argument. Many of the Jews didn't agree with the rabbis. Many Jews felt the way you felt, which is fine. This is a debate. Both sides have a very legitimate argument to be made. Yes, with me? Give me a look, Alex. Okay, so the rebels refused to give in. They refused to allow the rabbis to settle for peace. The rabbis are begging, let us sue. They're offering peace. Let's take it. The rebels refused to allow the rabbis to give in and to surrender. They want to fight to the end. Okay? In fact, the rebels believed that not enough Jews were on their side. You could argue that the majority of people living in the city of Jerusalem were actually moderates and wanted not to fight forever. They were surrounded. There was a siege around the city, although they had food and all that. So the rebels believed that the only way they're going to grow their ranks to get more people to be willing to fight against Jerusalem, fight against the Romans, is to make them desperate. As long as the Jews, here's another point by the way, the Jews had supplies that the Talmud says that would have lasted them for 10 years. Wow. In their besieged city of Jerusalem, they had a lot of supplies. They were settled. They knew the Romans were coming. This wasn't a surprise. One day they knew from when they declared independence in 66 CE, they knew the Romans were coming. And as the Romans fought their way down through the northern part of Israel, it took a long time. They had a long time to prepare themselves and to stock up supplies and to prepare themselves. They were well stocked, they were well fortified. The Jews were not going anywhere. They were willing to take their time. So the rebels that wanted to get out there and fight and be more aggressive felt that the Jews are not motivated to fight. So you got to motivate them. We got to make them desperate. And here comes the saddest story of them all. Sandy, you want to read a very sad story? Sandy, you want to read? Text 14, page 63.
There were these hooligans then in the city. The sages said to them, "Let us go out and make peace with them." But they would not allow it. On the contrary, they said, "Let's go out and fight them." The sages said, "You will not succeed." The hooligans rose up and burnt stores of wheat and barley. A famine ensued.
Do you understand the tragedy of this? It's just, the tragedy is overwhelming. Here the rebels are so sure of their position, of their need to fight against the Romans, that they're willing to literally starve Jews to death, to starve them, to make them fight against the Romans, which is fight for their death. And by the way, this story in the Talmud is also written in Josephus. He actually writes it a little differently, that Yochanan of Gush Chalav, who was the leader of one rebel group, felt that not enough people on his side. So he burnt the storage houses of another rebel group, of Shimon ben Giora, so the people would have to side with him and not with the other rebel leader. You understand the infighting is going on, terrible. And so now the Jews are starving. They're besieged in the city. The siege has already lasted a very long time. Their storage houses that had them fortified have been destroyed by Jewish people. They want to force them to go out and fight against the Romans, not just to sit inside their city and wait patiently, but to go out and fight. Now the situation in Israel has gotten very desperate. They was forced the rebels are forcing the Jews' hands. Text 15. Sai, want to read text 15?
Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai went out to walk in the marketplace. He observed people boiling hay and drinking its water. He said, people who subsist on hay soup are going to defend against Vespasian's forces? He said, the only solution is for me to leave from here.
Understand? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, I'm bailing ship. I gotta get out of here. The rebels have created this desperation. It's bad news. I'm getting out of here. And he's leaving.
Did the rest of the Jews do anything to punish the rebels for what they had done to those?
What could they do? The rebels were violent. They were dangerous. They were ruthless. That's why they were called Sicarii. They were killed. I don't disagree with them. They believe that if you don't want to fight the Romans, you're a rebel against Judaism, you're fighting, you're a heretic, you deserve to be killed.
But they were outnumbered, and the other Jews had weapons too, didn't they?
So you have a civil war going on. Instead of fighting the Romans, you're fighting each other. This is not a very effective way of winning the Romans.
So in other
I must
words,
tell you that.
there were enough of these rebels that it would have been practical.
There were 6, Josephus writes that there were 6 different rebel groups. Each with their own, they were guerrillas. I'm saying the main government was in favor of making peace. There were 6 different factions with different leaders, each fighting against the Romans. You think only today, like the Israeli government today, like 45 different political parties. Back then, they're all rebels against the Romans. You have 6 different kinds of rebel groups against the Romans. The different parties, whatever. What do you guys say? If you're Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, if you're a Jew and you hear Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai wants to leave town, he wants to get out of should he leave Jerusalem or not?
Where is he going?
He's going to Vespasian to make peace. Not to make peace. He'll see what he does. I shouldn't say he's going to make peace. He says, I'm leaving town. Jerusalem is gone. So can they fight? Jerusalem is done. If they're living off of hay and soup of hay, there's no hope here. The only solution is for me to leave. Now I'm going to tell you in a second that he wasn't allowed to leave. Because the rebels, by the way, knowing that the Jews wanted a dessert when there was hunger and go submit to the Romans, they had guards on the inside of the walls, not letting Jews out. So on the outside of the walls, you have the Romans besieging the city. On the inside of the walls, you have the Jewish rebels guarding the city. So you have the rabbis and the moderates in the Temple Mount, controlling the temple, and you have the rebels in the lower part of the city, the high part of the city and the lower part of the city, surrounding the lower part of the city, not allowing anyone who wants to surrender to even surrender, to keep morale high.
So they defeated themselves.
But let's go a step, So let's go step by step. Let's first discuss Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai leaving. Should he leave or should he stay? You could argue that he should stay. There's a chance of victory. Why are you giving up on the Jewish people in Jerusalem? There's fighters here. You could argue that never surrender, right? You could argue that the captain should be the last one to leave the ship. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is one of the leaders of the Jewish people. On the other hand, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, in his mind, there's no hope of victory. Which today historians would agree with that assessment. He was very practical. He said, there's no way we're going to... By the way, Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Benel, hundreds of years later, would write that why were the Jews fighting in Jerusalem? They knew that they were going to lose. So he said there's a verse that says that God will bring the affliction of the Egyptians upon the Jews. What's the affliction? One of the curses. That the Jews would suffer the sicknesses of Egypt. What was the illness of Egypt? They knew they were being destroyed by God, and they kept the Jews as slaves. And another plague, and another plague, and another plague. They were so stubborn in their ways. Rabbi Yochanan says there's no chance of victory. Sometimes surrender is the best choice. And I'm not the captain. Who was the captain? Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel was the Nasi. He was a great sage, but he wasn't the official leader of the Jewish people. And finally, as we're going to see, he felt that most importantly, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, I have a mission I have to create a post-temple version of Judaism. I have to allow for the survival of the Jewish people.
Right. That was the beginning of the diaspora. That was the beginning
Absolutely.
of the belief that we don't need the temple to have Judaism.
Absolutely.
That was the beginning of the synagogue form of Judaism.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Okay. So what happens? Yochanan ben Zakkai decided I'm leaving the town. Now, there's a problem. I told you that you weren't allowed to leave the town. There were rebels there. So what does he do? I'll tell you the story outside because there's still a lot to talk about. Text 16, we'll leave it for now. I'll tell you the story, what it says in text 16. He calls his nephew, Abba Sikra. Abba Sikra is one of the leaders of these hooligans. Perhaps named Sikra from Sikari, but that we don't know. And he says, what are you fighting for? We can't win. We're weak, we're hungry, we don't have supplies. We're not going to win the Romans. At this point it's over, we surrender. We can't, how are we going to win them? How are we going to destroy an army camped around the city of Jerusalem? So he says, at this point I can't do anything. If I say we should surrender, they'll kill me because now I'm a traitor, I'm a turncoat, right? I'm in trouble. So Yochanan ben Zakkai says, help me get out of the city. I'm going to go speak to the Romans. So what do? They devise a plan. They start a rumor that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is very sick. He's ill. And after a few days of him being ill, and people coming to pray for him, they send the messages. What's that message? They say, Mishberach, Yochanan ben, I don't know his mother's name, whatever. Say a prayer for him. They put foul-smelling fruits in his room, like rotten fruits. It began to smell like he was dead. And the word got out that he had passed away. His close students tore their garments, made a whole shiva, he died. Whole morning. Now, by Jewish law, you're not allowed to bury someone in Jerusalem. Jerusalem, there's no burial inside, it's a holy city. You have to bury outside the walls of Jerusalem. So the rebels had to allow coffins out of the city. They were also religious Jews. They were all religious Jews. Everyone was religious. And so Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was put into a coffin, held by his students and knew he was alive, because a living person is much lighter than a dead person. Abba Sikra, the nephew, who was a rebel, but he was a nephew, he was a relative, he led the procession. And when they came to the gates, the Jewish guards that were guarding the gates, said, who is this? He's Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai passed away. So he said, let's stab him with a spear to make sure he's really dead. These are the rebels. They want to make sure he's really dead. They knew that Jews were trying to escape in coffins. That was the only way to get out of the city, because you weren't allowed to be buried in the city. So let's stab him. So his nephew says, are you going to allow the Romans who are watching everything to say that the Jews stabbed their rabbis and after they're dead? He says, so let's push the coffin. He says, you're going to allow the Romans to say that? So eventually they let the coffin go through because of his great prestige. They allowed the coffin to go through unmolested. No spears, no swords. Coffin goes through. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is out of the city. He comes to the Romans, he surrenders, and he's brought before Vespasian the general. Okay? He's standing before Vespasian, text 16b.
Right, that's a fact.
Andrew, 16b.
That's a famous
We
story.
read Vespasian, Rabbi Yochanan said to him, peace be unto you, king, peace be unto you, king. Vespasian replied, you deserve the death penalty on 2 counts of treason. First, I am not king, and you have called me king. Second, if I am king, why have you not come to me until now?
Meaning, for years I'm fighting this revolution. For years I'm fighting this. I'm fighting against the city of Jerusalem. And now you come to me after 2 years, after 3 years, saying, "Oh, king." Said Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai.
Said Rabbi Yochanan, the truth is that you are a king. Were you not, Jerusalem would not be given into your hands. For it says, the Lebanon will fall to the mighty one. And as to why I have yet to come, this is because the hooligans have not allowed this. In the meantime, a messenger arrived from Rome and said to Vespasian, arise, Caesar had died, and the great men of Rome have decided to appoint you at the head. He then said to Rabbi Yochanan, I am leaving, and another person will be sent in my place. Ask me for something, and I will award it to you.
Okay, before we go further, I'm going to ask you. You're Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. You're standing there. You've just proven your wisdom to the king. The king he's in a good mood. He's just appointed the Caesar. He says, you got it. Ask for a request, I grant it. The Jewish homeland is facing an imminent threat. Jewish life is uncertain what will be next. The Jews are in a dangerous situation. You're Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. What do you ask for?
Put your arms down.
Okay. What do you ask for, Carol?
I read it.
You read ahead.
I read ahead.
What do you ask for? Alex, what would you ask for?
Let people go.
What?
Let people go.
Why did he ask for peace?
You would argue, many of you seem to be saying he should have said, go home, don't capture Jerusalem. Maybe he should have. But here's what the story is. Here's what he asks for. Text 16c, some of the most famous lines. He said to him, Tim, you want to read it?
He said to him, give me Yavneh and its sages, the family chain of Rabban Gamaliel, and physicians to heal Rabbi Masada. Rabbi Yosef, and some say Rabbi Akiva, said of this, God turns wise men backward and makes their knowledge foolish. He ought to have asked Vespasian to leave altogether this time. Rabbi Yochanan, however, thought that Vespasian would not grant that much, and then even something minor would not be.
Okay, this is so much this statement of the Talmud. Let's first start with the simple stuff. What is Yavneh? Yavneh was a small town to the southwest of Jerusalem. This was a town where many of the Jews that had surrendered to the Romans were being sent to as a controlled, not a prison per se, but that's where the prisoners of war were being sent. And obviously life there was being administered and being very tightly controlled by the Romans. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, when he surrendered to Vespasian, he assumed that that's where he would be sent as a prisoner to the city of Yavneh. There were many Jews, and presumably many of the rabbis had already managed to smuggle themselves out of the city, were already living. So his request to Vespasian is, when I go to the city, instead of just the Romans controlling it, allow me to once again make the Sanhedrin, and to establish a yeshiva, and to establish a formal center of Torah study in this Roman-controlled city of Yavneh. That's the first request he asks for. The second request he asks for, very much connected, and the third is connected, Rabbi Gamliel's family. The Romans, when they were captured at a place that had been a revolution, they would destroy, they would kill the family of all the family members of the leaders. Destroy the revolution, and he follows the revolution, destroy the whole family. This is a standard Roman procedure. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel was the Nasi. He was the leader, he was the Torah head of the entire Jewish people, and his leadership of the yeshiva was critical in the continuation of Torah study, of Torah leadership, etc. And so indeed the Romans would kill Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, but the family, the Gamliel family, his son, who would indeed eventually become the next Nasi, the next prince, the next leader of the Jewish people, should be spared. And the third request was for Rabbi Tzadok, who was also a very, very great Torah sage, who at that time, having praying for Jerusalem, was very, very ill, that also this great rabbi should also be saved for the future of Judaism. Not all the rabbis agree. Rabbi Akiva, who, by the way, what's Rabbi Akiva known for being a supporter of who? Bar Kochba. Right? So he was obviously of a different camp. Rabbi Akiva says that God turned the wise men backward. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai understood something very, very important. What do you understand? What causes every single type of nation to cease to exist? He knew what was coming. Tremendous shifts, tremendous changes were going to come. Hundreds of thousands of more Jews will be killed in the coming months, in the coming year. Not millions of Jews will be killed. Probably a million of Jews will be killed. The temple will be destroyed. Jews will be sent into exile. Jews will be moved all over. The diaspora was going to begin. This is exactly the kind of change that would cause other nations to cease to exist as a nation. And therefore, precisely because of that, Rabbi Yochanan said, what factor could I ask for that will guarantee Jewish continuity? What could I ask for to ensure that life will continue as Jewish people? And so he says, Ten li Yavneh v'chachamel, give me Yavneh. He understood the key to Jewish survival is Torah. And so while the war was waging in Jerusalem, while millions of people were being killed and the temple being destroyed, Torah was being rebuilt from the ground up in the small city of Yavneh to the southwest of Jerusalem. Vespasian probably thought of Yochanan ben Zakkai was crazy. He was probably expecting him to ask for something important, for a military concession, for a right for the Jews to have some kind of government, for some religious freedom. But that's because he's a military man. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai wanted the people to be able to study Torah. He understood that that's what will guarantee our continuation long after the temple is destroyed.
Does that make him the most important rabbi in Jewish history?
It makes him one of the saviors of Jewish... Yes, absolutely. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is credited with single-handedly saving Torah Judaism. Now, let's continue the story. The temple destroyed. The Jews have either been killed, sold as slaves, scattered. Some Jews still living in Israel, completely under absolute Roman domination. There is no temple, there is no independence in any way, shape, or form. The Jews are slowly getting life back into order, except in Masada. What's happening in Masada? So according to Josephus, it was the followers of this man, Judas the Galilee, his son Nachum, who believed that it was disloyal to be subjects to any other nation, and they absolutely, categorically refused to ever become followers of the Romans. They refused. And so what happens? They separate themselves from the rest of their brothers. The whole Jewish nation has been destroyed. They refuse to surrender like the rest of the Jews. They separate from the Jews. They make their way to Masada to find an independent place where they can continue to live in liberty with God alone as their only master. What happens? They're holding out here in Masada. The Roman ramp is completed. The defensive wall is breached. And Elazar knows the end is near. Now, if you were Elazar, you would think you would want to fight. Fight till the end. These are people that have been fighters. They are rebels. But why does he choose suicide instead? We've explained that. What was his philosophy? According to his philosophy, it's impossible for a Jew to worship another nation. God took us out of Egypt to never worship another nation again, to only worship God. Now he sees at this point that's not possible. It's not possible. Therefore, there's only one solution in his mind. God is causing the Jewish people to become extinct. There is no way in Eliezer's mind that God could allow Jews to live under Roman control. It's impossible. The fact that at this point it's also impossible we're going to destroy the Romans because we've been totally obliterated and we have 960 men left in some holdout in Masada means Judaism is over. Judaism is over. It's impossible that we should continue. It would be a sin in his mind to surrender or even to fight and to be captured alive by the Romans. And therefore, if you look at his speech, we read part of his speech earlier, but let's read another part of the speech that he gives. Text 17, Lisa, you want to read text 17? This is from the speech that Elazar gives on the night before they all commit suicide on the top of Masada.
My loyal followers, long ago we resolved to serve neither the Romans nor anyone else but God, because He alone is the true and righteous Lord. And now the time has come that bids of us to prove our determination indeed. At this moment, we must not disgrace ourselves. Until today, we have never submitted to servitude, even when it brought no danger with it. We must not choose servitude now, and with it the penalties awaiting us if we fall alive into the hands of the Romans. We were the very first that revolted against them, and we are the last that fight against them. I cannot but regard it as a favor that God has granted us, that it is still in our power to die nobly and in a state of freedom, which has not been the case of others.
It's an amazing philosophy. There's no way that God would allow us to be under the Romans, which means that God has ended the Jewish people. We are faced with extinction. We are blessed, he says, because we were so loyal to God. God is returning the loyalty, and God is allowing us to die nobly instead of dying by the hands of the Romans. But there's no way that we can continue, yes.
Did they know that Yavneh survived? Or?
Of course they knew. Yavneh was from before the destruction of the temple.
No, but so then it wouldn't be the end of Judaism if they know that Yavneh...
In their minds, a Judaism under Roman rule is not Judaism. It's like having a synagogue, I don't know, it's not Judaism. Judaism cannot be, let's go back to this verse.
Yeah, but it was before. It's not like it's just one guy. They survived under the Romans before.
First of all, they fought against the Romans, but even when they were under the Romans before, there was always an independence. They had the Roman governor, etc., but they had the temple, they had a certain element of independence. The government came to collect taxes. The Jews still have their own form of government. They were paying taxes. Now there was no form of Jewish government. There was no more Sanhedrin, there was no more Beis Din, there was no more rabbis, there was no more, there was nothing. Now they're under complete control of the Romans. It's over. The temple's over. Nothing to fight for. Even earlier, when they were under the Roman governors, they believed we got to fight. What was Judas saying? We got to fight. And as long as they could fight, they were, they're fighting for a cause. They're fighting to break free from the oppression. Here they see there's nowhere they're ever going to be free. They're going to be captured. They're going to fight. Some of these men will be captured alive. Some of these women will be captured alive. Taken to Rome to do whatever they want to do with her. In their minds, it's impossible. That's part of God's plan.
But when they were in even worse situations in Babylon and in Egypt, they didn't feel that was...
Well, first of all, they weren't the same people. They weren't the same people. It's about you asking the same question that really is Tom.
But I mean, okay, but
You're
the
right.
rabbis knew what the...
The rabbis, this is not the rabbis here. This is a group of rebels.
Oh, okay.
But this group of rebels, you're right. The Jews have been in Babylonia. That's true. The Jews have been under other governments. That's true.
And they had not thought that they weren't still Jews. So why would...
This group of rebels believed that they were making a mistake by being under Babylon.
But if there were more people that didn't feel that way than there were the rebels, why didn't the rest of the people just say, if you don't like it, get out of here?
They did. That's why they went to Masada. The people on Masada are a very, very small minority. They've separated themselves from the remaining Jewish community. The main Jewish community is completely surrounded to the Romans.
Weren't there other places where Jews lived besides in that area?
Yeah, but they weren't fighting. Masada was the last place that was fighting the Romans. After the destruction of the temple, the war was over.
Yeah, but I'm saying, if there were Jews that lived elsewhere that had nothing to do with all of this, then Judaism would still go on. It was only the one group of Jews that would die.
Yes. Let me say something. What I'm saying now is not the Jewish perspective. This is the perspective of this group of rebels. In their mind, the Jews that lived early, that were under other forms of occupation, were not loyal to God.
It doesn't make sense.
Something doesn't make sense.
Yeah, let's give you a chance. Now,
you can be loyal to God inward, internally, and survive. I think the key is when it comes to survival, you're going to do anything to survive. And you can be loyal to God and Judaism internally. Doesn't have to be outwardly.
You have the same question? What's your question? And then you'll take the next. Yeah? Rabbi Yochanan, yeah.
What, is he the smartest one? He's the only one who saw this picture? Nobody else did? All the rabbis in Jerusalem, they saw the destruction that's going on in Israel, what the Romans are doing.
Some rabbis were in favor of revolt. Rabbi Akiva was in favor of Bar Kochba. Rabbi Akiva was in favor of revolution. He felt that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai made a big mistake. Some rabbis that agreed with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai were paralyzed by the overwhelming disaster that they saw coming, and they weren't able to actually visualize a plan for rebuilding. The brilliance of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was not just that he saw the destruction that's coming. A lot of people saw the destruction that was coming. He saw the way to build after that destruction. He was already focused on how am I going to make sure that in 100 years from now, or in 2,000 years from now, there will still be Judaism. That was his brilliance. Yeah.
Two quick questions. How do we know that it's 900 and so many people?
That's what Josephus writes.
Okay. And
He was there. Josephus was there.
And then this is the same Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai fled, right?
Shimon Bar Yochai is a little bit later. Shimon Bar Yochai fled. Okay, after the Romans conquered, destroyed the temple and all that, they remained the rulers of Israel for a long time. They were terrible to the Jews. Many, many terrible things to the Jews. They killed Rabbi Akiva, the 10 martyrs. I mean, many terrible things happened to the Jewish people after the Romans. Once the Romans took over Israel and destroyed the temple, there were no more religious freedom, no more independence, no more nothing. They outlawed Torah, they outlawed the Shabbos, they outlawed the Jewish calendar. Many, many laws. The Jews living in Israel after the destruction of the temple faced terrible, terrible persecution. Religious persecution. Meaning, their gamble lost. That's not the point. The point is that these rebels, although you don't agree with it, that's fine. You're entitled to disagree. I also disagree with it. Me and you're on the same page. I also disagree. But I was wondering, that's what the debate means.
That's right.
There was a group of Jews that debated the rabbis. And they said, based on this verse, they are my servants who I took out of the land of Egypt, that God said the Jewish people can only be servants to me and to nobody else.
But didn't the Jews have to listen to the rabbis? I mean, the rabbis
Yeah, I wish. Last week's time, also the Jews didn't listen. The whole the Sadducees and the Dead Sea, they didn't listen to the rabbis either.
But God, Wasn't
think
it
being a
God-
rabbi is so easy, huh? You just say something, everyone listens to you.
But didn't God say that, that the rabbis were in charge and they were supposed to
Yeah,
listen to
God
the
said that,
rabbis?
but they still. That's not the way the story goes. What can I tell you? It's never gone that way. That's just not the way the story goes. Let's talk about this verse. This verse. They are my servants who I took out of the land of Egypt, according to these rebels that are fighting and willing to commit suicide, also against Jewish law. Commit murder. They're murdering their wives, they're murdering their kids. Because in their minds, it was a murder. In their minds, to live under other occupation is worse. It's not Jewish. That's even worse. Better to die. It's an honor God's giving us, instead of being killed by the Roman, that we can die instead of going against His will. The rabbis interpret this verse very differently. The rabbis interpret this verse that it's not telling you you're not allowed to live under the lands of Egypt. It's telling you how to maintain your serenity, how to maintain your normalcy when you live under a foreign government. That even when you're under a foreign government, you're still a servant of God.
So it's okay to pay taxes?
To be, yes, it's okay to pay taxes. Even in Coral Springs, we keep on raising our taxes every single year.
Yeah.
Yes, even here. The point, yeah.
And not picking up our hurricane debris.
Yeah.
The people on Masada were against the rebels.
No, they were the rebels.
No, they were the rebels.
They were the last holdout of the rebels.
They were the rebels.
They were the last rebels, the last ones, the last holdout of the rebels against the rabbis. But they were very religious Jews. They followed the rabbis and everything else. The mikveh, everything was about their according to. But in this area, they fundamentally disagreed. Fundamentally. Now, I want to.
Is there a name that they're known by in history, like the Maccabees, or any name that identifies that?
The Sakiri. There were different groups of rebels. There were different groups. They were called the Zealots. They were the rebels. Kushman Chalab, different groups. The point is, what did Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai understand? A Vespasian could subjugate the Jew, but the Jew will always prevail. I'll tell you a very brief story before we finish. When the previous Chabad Rebbe was arrested by the communist government, by the Svetskia, the Jewish branch of the communist government, and originally they were going to kill him. And then they changed his death sentence to a life sentence. Then they changed it to 10 years of hard labor. Then eventually changed it to 3 years of exile in Kostroma, in Siberia. Eventually he was released. But when he left the prison, where he had been incarcerated from the 15th of Shavuos until the 3rd day of Tammuz, he went from there to the train station to go to Siberia, where he was being exiled for his counter-revolutionary activities and spreading Judaism in communist Russia. When he was going to the train station, they sent out a message that no Hasidim should come to see him in the train station because it was dangerous. The government was there, the spies were there, everyone was there watching who's coming. But the followers of the Rebbe were desperate to see the Rebbe because no one knew when they would see him again. No one knew when the next time they would see the Rebbe was. He was going into exile, and many people in Russia, he went to Siberia and didn't come back. Hundreds of people came to crowd the train station where the Rebbe was going off to Kostroma. The Rebbe comes to the train station, surrounded by guards. He's in prison. He's a prisoner, going to his sentence, going into exile in Siberia, in a city called Kostroma. He sees the hundreds of Hasidim there, and he got up on top of a bench in the train station and began to say a discourse, began to give a speech. Saying the Frierdiker Rebbe, who had been tortured, by the way. He had been thrown down flights. He came out of that prison a different man physically. They threw him downstairs, they beat him. He ended up in a wheelchair for the rest of his life from that time. He stood up on top of a bench, and he said a short talk. Part of what he said is as follows, quoting from his father, the 5th Chabad Rebbe, that not by our choice were we put into exile, not by our choice will we leave exile, but only our body is in exile. The soul of a Jew is not imprisoned by the countries in which we live in. Our bodies are in exile. Our bodies are subject to the non-Jews that are controlling us. But our souls were never put into exile, and therefore our souls will always be free. This is what he said as he was going to exile, in front of the Russian guards, in front of the spies, in front of the KGB agents, in the train station, in front of hundreds of Hasidim. Meaning, me and you are on the same page. The message we take from this verse is not that you can't physically be under a foreign government. Be under a foreign government, pay taxes. The soul is what's free. The soul is what's serving God. Soul is the servant of God. There's another message here, which is how do you show that you're loyal to God? Not by trying to avoid a circumstance where you have no one else telling you what to do, because that's not realistic. In life, we all have other masters, so to say. We all have people that are telling us what to do, right? Especially if you're married, yeah? We have a boss, you have many masters that are calling you and demanding this and demanding that. And we don't have autonomy to do what we want when we want it. But what does it mean to be a servant of God? That we understand that wherever we're going, our souls are being put there on a divine mission to do what God wants us to do in that place. Anyway, understand that message is a very, very important message. Let's conclude.
So you can argue that they killed themselves, they killed their bodies, not their soul.
Exactly right. Meaning that the Jews, the rebels felt that if our bodies are in exile, our souls are in exile. And Yochanan ben Zakkai said our soul could be in exile, our body could be in exile, our temple could be destroyed, but our soul can remain loyal to God. And that's the beauty of Torah. This text is going to bring out this idea. Text number 18, this is a beautiful text from Simon Shachma, who is a very well-known historian. And he describes how when Jerusalem fell, right, Titus brought a whole celebration, a victory parade into the streets of Rome. And they made, as part of the victory procession, they built this big Ark of Titus. Still there till today, you can go and see it, right? Text number 18. Denise, you want to read?
Given the hammer blows of the Roman legions, and coming as they did after century upon century of blows from Egyptians, Syrians, and Babylonians, there would have been scant reason to suppose that the Jews would survive as a people. And yet, 2,000 years later, the Jews are still here. How? Well, one answer could be found back at the Arch of Titus. Not something that's here, but something that's not. When Josephus describes the procession of loot and prisoners paraded through the streets of Rome, he says, "And last of all the spoils was carried the laws of the Jews." But where are the laws in the Arch of Titus? Where are the Torah scrolls? Conspicuously, tellingly, they are absent. What were scrolls of law anyway? Just many words on parchment, not really worth the time of the sculptor or the course of the marble. But words copied, memorized, internalized, made unforgettable, will beat swords anytime. You can't hold words captive. The Roman Empire has come and gone.
Good stuff, huh?
You go into a synagogue any Saturday, and you'll still hear those words. In September 1913, Dr. Sigmund Freud, the godless Jew, was in Rome, and he sent a postcard of the Arch of Titus to a friend. On it he wrote, "The Jew
Überstellt. The Jews survived it. This is so beautiful. It's not surprising that the Torah scroll was overlooked by the Roman artists. Why? Because the Romans didn't go to Judea and spend all that money and all those lives to fight the war to capture a Torah scroll. They went to capture territory, to capture loot, to capture gold, to capture slaves. That's what they came for. And some Jews, including the rebels, were looking at life through the very same prism. They had the same perspective. And they felt that if we no longer have that independence, if we no longer have our own autonomous territory, and our own temple, we're done. Our lives are over. Our spiritual identity is gone. But Rabbi Yochanan, that's the son of the sculptor. The Romans looked at it. But for Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he had the exact opposite perspective. He understood that Torah is the key to the future of Judaism because the true identity of a Jew is his spiritual identity, his soul. The body can be in exile. We cannot have a territory. We cannot have gold. We cannot have the buildings. If we have the Torah, if we have the soul of Judaism, then the Jew can survive it all. And so in hindsight, when you look back, the secret of the survival of Judaism was not to fight against the Romans to save the temple or for political independence. It was tenli Yavneh v'chachameh. By having Yavneh, by having a center where Judaism could once again thrive as a Torah center, that ensured, guaranteed, that the spiritual identity of the Jew would never be lost, no matter what country we live in, no matter what government would oppress us, etc. And this is our secrets. Good night. Yes.
So the Jews did survive the
Thank you.